Dave says, you must have things pretty rigged. I was talking about my Facebook lack of friend or lack of kind of getting into it when you could successfully ignore 99 friend notifications of that. That's pretty fun. No, there's like that. It's been going on for years. And it's not, of course, that I'm aloof or not interested in people. I just don't want people to think that I use Facebook to communicate. I basically use nothing to communicate. Sales mostly. Interesting. So you're in like a bunch of like difficult sales situations. All right. Okay, guys. So I actually have a slide today. There's something where, and I'm interested in what you have to say, Julie. Of course, I'm not changing. Oh, someone. I guess whoever's typing now is not a friend. Anyway, I think maybe before the recording, I was joking. It was pretty surprising when it said a friend is typing a comment because I only have a very few Facebook friends. And the ones I have is mostly out of necessity where I had to add somebody to the group or something like that. And it's not like I'm playing favorites or anything. Things coming close, but then falling over. Oh, that stinks. I'm sorry, Julie. Got to add up where you get better and better. I don't mean that you're not great at it now, but you keep accumulating a sense. Myron was talking the other night about how to get better at sales, you basically have to be worse at sales for a while. And there's no path to being good at sales that doesn't really go through being bad, at least in his estimation. And that's a reasonable way to look at things. Of course, you could maybe have some golden boy or girl, man or woman that never has an issue, but who knows? All right. Remember the frame, but remember that I talk about sales in terms of navigating frames, right? Like a little bit like a combination lock, and you're trying to discover which frames you need in your favor. Things like being in the person's in-group, but there's all sorts of frames and what mood they're in and how they're viewing their finances, how they frame your service. Is it an advertising budget thing? Is it an extra thing? Is it necessary? Is it extra? There's a lot of things like that are categories. When I say frames also, it's like categories. And you're trying to click all the right categories or enough categories into place that are critical or find the critical ones and get yourself on the right side of those categories in order to make a sale. Of course, better if I were to name all the categories, but of course they vary and stuff like that. But I gave an indication of a few. Yeah, last night's webinar was awesome and we have the replay. Excellent, Mike. Okay. So I'll get into the thing for today and then we'll go back to discussion. Hey, great to have you here, Lawrence. Excellent. Okay, so I have a slide for y'all. And a little bit of a Southern slang there with the y'all. I grew up in New York, outside of New York City, but been here in the South for a while. Anyhow, so maybe I shouldn't go to this yet. I'll just tease you with it and come back for a second. But there's something that I realized. I was thinking about reality construct, thinking about frames, thinking about the question as well from maybe a couple weeks back about trusting feelings, right? And when do I trust my feelings? And like with personal relationships, at what point do I trust my feelings was the question. I'm blanking out if it was Ryan or someone else that was on the webinar. Sorry, I'm laughing. My brain made a little white men joke because there's some white man did the question. Maybe we have too many white men asking questions around here. There's been a lot of talk about white men and how terrible we all are. Anyhow, recently in the news. Anyhow, so I was thinking about that question about when we trust our feelings. I may have mentioned, but one of the things that I want to get across about that is that you essentially are always trusting your feelings, much like a car is driving in the direction it's going. The real question is what boundaries, red flags, signals are there for when you additionally act, again, as if there's boundaries or red flags. And it's not that you really ever stop trusting your feelings. The question is more like whether you stop, whether you attempt to steer, whether you attempt to look at what you're standing on. Last webinar, I made a bit of a distinction. I don't know how much I explicitly emphasized it, but there's two different, they're both useful, but one is more well-known and one is much less well-known, to say the least, about stepping back and thinking about like the frames that you're using to look around. With the mental image I gave last webinar, then there's a certain amount of stepping back from the kind of narrow box that you might end up functionally be looking in and have tunnel vision with. There's a certain amount of stepping back you can do if someone steps back and thinks about what they really want in a relationship partner, about what they really want in a business or what their sales strategy should be or whatever. That's pretty normal for people to understand to do that. But then there's a place where people can no longer functionally really step back. They can, but they don't really realize to or how to. And part of what we're doing in law of implication is understanding how to step back all the way and fully and look at assumptions we're making, perspectives we have, frames that we have that otherwise would be fully invisible to us because they're so universal and normal. It doesn't occur to us to step back from those. And then furthermore, as I indicated in this original post for today's webinar, one of the reasons I talk a lot about things being relatively effortless and easy, it's not because I'm blowing smoke up anyone's butt or anything like that. It's because I think that's the phrase, right? But it's because, or that I'm being overly enthusiastic or exaggerating. It just stands to reason that if normally people don't really think too much about where they stand, and quite the opposite, they want to defend implicitly and subconsciously, sometimes explicitly, they want to defend that they're already standing on the right frame, their frames are already correct, they're already awesome, that sort of thing. So they actually have a defense mechanism in place from examining where they're standing, especially what they're like particularly standing on that they don't step back from. And when you are standing on the right frame, analogously, when you're doing sales and you have the right frames in place, because it's not one frame, it's like a multiple frames. When you're standing on the right frame or have the right succession of frames, then things are pretty effortless and easy. And our mind and body do the rest, and momentum and flow take care of the rest. So since that's the case, then as you guys know, but as I never gets old, for at least for me, emphasizing or saying in slightly different ways, the method of success, the one that's universal and true, even though people don't really know it, is that if you get your frames right, then that's like all you have to do, right? So the more practice, the more distinctions, the more awareness and skill and so forth you have of realizing and improving on frames, both for yourself and then regarding sales for other people, their frames and categories regarding you and your product and such, then the more practice and aware distinctions and stuff you have regarding that's like all you need for success. The rest, accumulating the associations and recipes and what people normally think of as intelligence, which is like spotting stuff and noticing things and patterns and associations and so forth, will pretty much take care of itself, right? For some people, it might take care of itself a little faster than others in different areas of life. And so, right, we have different strengths and capacities and intelligences in different aspects of life. But essentially it's going to be downhill and pretty reliable and easy when you get your frames right. So it's essentially all you really need to do in life in a matter of speaking is get your frames right. Now that's a little bit like saying if you're going to drive across country, all you have to do is make sure that your car is in good repair and your GPS is hooked up right, or you have right directions, like know the nodes where you have to turn. And then otherwise, mostly the car and your mind in a relaxed way will take care of the driving straight. Most of what you do when you're driving across country is just drive straight, right? You're not, relative to how much time you spend driving straight, you're not making that many turns. You don't, while you're driving, typically need to repair your car much, hopefully, but you might have had to check on it before you drove, right? So you attend to certain overall frames and making sure you have like nodes and turns, right? That's NODES, right? Nodes, wherever you want to call the different places where you turn when you're driving across country. But it's a good illustration of what I mean, because a lot of if you don't distinguish if you just look at the whole thing, a lot of the effort is just driving straight, but that's in another way of speaking effortless, right? So if you attend to the kind of frames that are necessary, the car being repaired and the directions, which directions mostly means when to turn, right? You don't, when you have directions, you don't say, keep going straight. You don't have a list of keep going straight, right? If you're going to go straight for 100 miles, you don't keep repeating go straight 100 times, right? You just have it once. You might spend a couple hours just going straight with no turn. And that's also how life is, right? You spend most of it going straight in flow. And the question really isn't, when do I go straight? You see, that's asking the wrong type of question. You'll get what amounts to a sort of nonsense answer, which would be the same thing as if you were to ask for directions, you ask when you turn. You don't ask when you go straight, right? And so same thing in life. It's a great question, of course, in the context of our webinars to ask, when do I trust my feelings? But the answer is, you want to see things differently. You don't ask when you go straight. You basically always go straight, except for when you turn. And the issue becomes all about knowing where to turn, right? And then when it's our life in general, or if we're thinking about the car illustration I just talked about, driving across country, there's also things like having your car in repair, so in good repair, so it doesn't break down on the way. Things like that come up where you need things like that attended to, however that applies metaphorically to your situation. So that's why we're all about frames and understanding them and so forth. And so it always becomes that. If you are wondering whether to trust your feelings, again, the answer has to do with knowing not even when not to. In a sense, when you turn, you're not going straight. In another sense, you're always driving straight, right? Even when you're supposedly turning or merging or whatever, you're always in one, like going straight in one, even, right? Your curve, but at any particular moment, it's like calculus, right? There's always like a slope with a curve that's a straight slope. So in one way of thinking about it, you're always going straight when you're driving, and then you may also be turning sometimes, right? So your feelings are guiding you, but there might be certain boundaries where in practice they're not guiding you because you say, okay, that's outside of the boundaries. I'm not, and there's certain questions you don't ask. Like when I talked about if you're working on something, you don't ask, would I rather go to a movie right now? If you conclude that you need to do some task for work, or if you have a sales presentation coming up or whatever, you don't ask things like that, right? So there's certain feelings or questions you don't access because they're just silly to ask those types of questions. Lauren says, on that note, what are the frames you've discovered for immersion? I've been trying to immerse myself consciously and getting stuck in a few areas. Interesting. Yeah, it's a great thing to ask. What you can do is you try to go for something and then you try to get a sense of what the issue is that comes up, right? And then you try to either deal with that issue directly, or if you can't, then you try to see what's underlying or framing that coming up. So let's say there's a person who's going to distract you. You might not be able to directly ask them not to. That might just not even work, right? They might just ignore you and still distract you. They might give you a disapproving glance and or look and still distract you. Or they might pout or get angry or whatever, and then not distract you for a while, but then all distracting because now they're pissed off. So in a case like that, just like with anything, right? If you can't accomplish something with what would otherwise be the most direct route, then you try to think, well, what could be different about the framing so that it happened naturally, right? Instead of trying to trite metaphor, but you could turn the wheel of a car, or you can, if it's going straight, you can keep trying to push it in the other direction, or you can turn it so it just naturally goes in a different direction. That's not necessarily very helpful. But a lot of us do this naturally with people in our lives, right? We have a frame that works pretty well, that feels natural to people where, okay, now I'm in my office and I'm working, and then other times I'm not. And then mostly the burden of proof is on them for bothering you while you're working. And the burden of proof, unfortunately, is then more on you when you're not supposedly working. The problem with that is sometimes you can get yourself in a career situation temporarily or however long, where you need to be open and it doesn't look like you're working in your office, but you need to be focused on, or at least prioritize work. So then you need to find a frame that kind of works with that and explain that to the best you can and so forth. Let me remind you with immersion, and now I'm not talking about someone else distracting you, I'm trying to talk about other things related to immersion, that sometimes there really are things that are important other than what you're trying to get immersed in. And there isn't. The best solution is to try to get those things tied off in your life, like either fully taken care of or boundary off in some way. So think about one of the useful frames I have, and this may or may not be helpful for your situation. You may have already heard me say it in different ways, but the idea of quarantining, where if there's things that are coming up that are distracting you, even if there's a persistent kind of thought or type of worry or thing that your mind goes to when you're trying to get immersed, then you can actually schedule time just to worry about that thing. Now, of course, that in and of itself will often reframe the thing you're worried about so that it becomes a little weird to just sit there and worry about it. But on the other hand, maybe it's something that takes some thought, and you could say, all right, I will go out, get some tea or coffee, or just walk around and whatever, or however you address it. But I'm gonna, in such and such a context, either at a certain time of day or for a certain amount of time, or while I'm taking a walk is not exact time frame. Of course, boundaries thing in that way. Then I'll think about this issue. But while I'm not taking a walk, specifically thinking about this distracting issue, I'm not going to be thinking about it. That act of kind of distinguishing and quarantining may well work for you. Trying to think what other things interfere with immersion beside people, kind of other tasks or worries or issues. Oh, maybe just a thing that you're trying to get immersed in just doesn't feel very immersive, right? Historically, you could be trying to get into a video game or a movie, but it's just not, you're not identifying with the character. It's not really doing it for you. So it's not very immersive naturally for you. Trying to think what I do there. A lot of that happens. You still get immersed anyway if you just let yourself transition and physically, as much as possible, surround yourself with the thing. You might not get into a game right away, but if you keep working at it and focusing on the game, you might get more into it. Same thing with a movie. So what you don't have to do is buy into the idea that just because you're not getting immersed in a certain arbitrary time frame, let's say someone's watching a movie and 5 minutes goes by and they're like, nah, I'm just not getting into this. Then they could create that whole belief. Or there's plenty of times that it just takes longer to transition or get immersed and so forth. And so if you don't just block yourself, then it's inevitable typically that you will get immersed. It just might take longer with certain things and having even less physical kind of distractions or things. So you combine quarantining off issues as best you can, removing them from your environment the best you can with little pings and dings and notifications or people there, burden of proof issues, right? Where you have to be busy in some way or else, you have no excuse or whatever for someone who wants to do something with you. So you try to do more eliminating and you try to do more not blocking yourself by taking on a premature belief that you can't get immersed in something. Because over time, you basically will. The more you see things as arbitrary in many cases, right? Whether or not a movie is immersive or a video game is immersive is mostly arbitrary, right? Sure, there's things that could for you make it more easily immersive, but again, just don't buy into it. It's just not very real that it is or isn't immersive, and it's just a matter of giving it more time and less distractions. So that'll do for now, and what I'll share with you today will help with everything. All right. So I was saying overall that there was the question about when you trust your feelings. There's also the idea of the reality construct that I want to explain to you guys better. And in doing so, I have something to clarify and emphasize for you guys that the difference between really understanding and applying what I'm showing you today and not is really similar to the difference between being functionally retarded and not. Great. That was somewhat helpful. There's always more I could potentially think of, or someone else could, other than me, that would think of more stuff. But great. I'm glad if that's helpful about the immersion. Okay, with what I'm going to talk to you about, this has to do with your reality construct, has to do with how we think, and I'm going to talk about objects and explain how they work when it comes to both reality and thinking and so forth. And again, it's time to emphasize this. There's bits and pieces of this that I've said, and I've said in some places many times, or in some ways of thinking about it, I've said it many times. But there's a way that there's distinctions and emphasis and clarity that I'm going to hopefully try to give today. And I have certain ideas to share with you that are going to be particularly poignant regarding this topic. And really the difference is just night and day. And you can't compare yourself before and after you get this, like hardly at all, the difference in your functional ability to think and wisdom and being able to be more flexible about the world and your frames and help influence other people in their frames the gap is just massive. Getting this, whether or not, I'll explain this, I always do a better job than we hope in the very sense that I'm aware of this stuff in the first place, but in another sense, there's going to be a significant lack of perfection, perhaps, in how I explain this in the webinar. But one way or the other, if you get to the extent that you get this, it's going to be massive for you. It's very important what I'm saying. It's a little bit the kind of thing where I wouldn't necessarily bring up day one of talking to a new person because it might seem like it doesn't apply to life directly, but I think you guys are at the point where you can get that and believe me when I say that it does it. Again, it's almost like being functionally retarded or not. And I don't use the word retarded pejoratively, but just because of kind of the brain reality of some people when they're held back by their brain development. There's just a way that you're unable to think basically about life accurate there's just an error in where you're standing that's so profound that thinking is just very difficult, essentially, and basically impossible. Of course, you can do it about a lot of things, but then you keep running into big issues, and that manifests itself all over the place with all kinds of specific things that you're trying to do. So this idea is deep, but as often with things like that, with what I talk about, the application is very mundane and surface and practical constantly, as well as profound and whatever. You can both adjust deep frames and more basic frames and stuff much differently as you understand this. All right. And what I'm saying here is not my perspective. It's not an opinion. It's not controversial once you understand it. It's what I'm saying, essentially. I might be able to hone in on it and distinguish it better over time. But again, it's not like some worldview, religious view or something that I have. It's not a philosophy or a school, and you'll see what I mean. All right. So my first statement is hard hitting potentially or eye opening. or kind of, well, what's he going to talk about? What I write here is objects are not real, as in they're not foundational, and more. It's not just, it's not as simple as just saying they're not foundational, but something came up when someone had some questions about evolution or faith. I was talking, she was texting me, asked me about a book that I talked about called Not a Chance. And she was talked to someone about evolution, and some questions came up. And so recently, and it helped me to, it provided a bit of context to help me think of explaining this to you guys. One of the things that evolutionists and people in general think is plausible, for example, is that the universe could create people and consciousness. And they say things like, well, why can't the universe create stuff or why can't the universe do it? Why does God have to do it? And I can illustrate things like saying, like, people tend to think that like a brain could maybe make consciousness. People don't think as avocados can make consciousness, right? You don't think, if I said, how many avocados do you need to put into a bowl in order to get a conscious machine or person that might take over the world, like in the Terminator, right? Or whatever. Because some of these funny little tech giants, funny little giants, sometimes they'll talk about, oh, maybe machines will take over the world, or they'll be like the Terminator kind of thing. Or artificial intelligence. Some people are scared of it. But that's literally like being scared of avocados taking over the world. And I don't mean like anthropomorphized one avocado. What if you just put a lot of avocados in a bowl? What if someone's like chucking avocados into a bowl and you're like, oh my, be careful, because that 13th avocado that you throw into the bowl, that might cause the entire system of avocados in the bowl to become conscious. And then it can get aggressive. So you have to be careful. So that's funny, probably, presumably not. But then when it gets blurry and little and the complicated stuff, then all of a sudden we think that you do the same thing with computer chips, right? Careful, if you integrate that last circuit, you might come alive and going wrong, or like a zombie, and terminate, start to die in that, right? And so forth. And that's just as funny once you understand how to think properly about objects and the world and so forth. That's not the primary use of understanding this stuff. You wouldn't believe how critical this is for just all kinds of thinking. I think it's also maybe one of the major differences left, that you guys are a little confused about how to, so I'm not confused is the right word, but again, there's a sense that like, that I still know something, I do something, I'm thinking, or have some kind of frame that I haven't maybe shared yet. And now I've tried to share this. I just haven't gotten to where there's something about this Capstone series and then these office hours, which are obviously an extension of them that are pretty similar, where I'm managing to hit topics in a way where you can look back and say, oh, David's mentioned that before, but there's something about where I'm hitting them in a way where it's all new and important and powerful and really gelling for a lot of people, clicking for people. And it might be time for this idea to really gel and click for people as well, even though I haven't tried to hold it back in the past, but I think we can really do it differently today. So it's not easy to directly explain to someone who thinks that if someone really thought that avocados, if you threw too many of them into a bowl, they would come alive and start to take over the world or get aggressive or conscious and all that stuff. Then if you stop and think about it, it's actually a little hard to explain to them why that isn't going to happen. It's probably funny to us, the idea of that happening when it comes to avocados. And we feel like that's just, how could you take like, all right, so 10 avocados is nowhere near going to do it. What is 20 going to do it? Or how many avocados, right, do you need before they all become conscious as a kind of an overall unit? But it's actually weirdly hard to explain, right? And similarly, when people think that evolution is possible, where the universe can just make stuff, it's a little hard outside of what I'm going to tell you now to explain why that is. And some of us might think that it's plausible that the universe can make things, but it's all the same error. And it ultimately is just as ridiculous as thinking that avocados can, in a bowl, cannot become alive and conscious and intentional. So what we need to come to understand is something deep. There's a deeper frame that is very hidden to people, that they don't realize they're making the error. And once they make that error, then they become metaphorically like functionally retarded when it comes to thinking. As always, when you have your frame wrong, it'll sometimes overlap with what's correct. And of course, people's very incorrect frame about objects and how they work and how they interact with thought and our reality construct of the mind and all that incorrect frame, the incorrectness does not interfere with a lot of people's lives, but then it also does. And it does way more than they realize as well. And this is really like this isn't just a small angle. This is the kind of thing where even though I've talked about a number of other topics, this is one of those topics that's pretty close to the whole enchilada in and of itself, just its own angle on things, right? There's a number of threads that if you pull on them, they unravel everything ultimately. And this is like one of those where it's really a whole major shift in and of itself. And it'll help clear a lot of, just like any of the threads, if you really pull on them well and you have these insights and a different frame shift from getting it, kind of like the overall win idea, things like that, it makes everything else easier. And this is going to be one of those things where understanding anything else is going to be way easier as you get this particular distinction and shift. So again, when I say objects aren't real, I'm not giving you a potential paradigm or a way of looking at things. I'm telling you something that is fundamentally right. And that again, you need to get to where you not just see it, but that it really makes you distinguish it everywhere. So there's no such thing as like a physical object out there. Not at all. And I'll continue to explain. What objects are mental objects. And what'll help to start to put the pieces in place is object. And I've said it before, but there's a way that I think that, that this will come across in a certain way today. They're very useful. Our mind makes objects as a way to represent different. And I'll give you an example where they'll kind of help picture this concept and also see how important and useful it is. So objects are really great and useful, but misunderstanding them creates all kinds of problems in other people. And realizing how this all works will help you explain things to other people in a different way over time. It'll give you like a bridge or a way to get there. Whereas if you don't know to explain this to people or that they have this wrong, then you keep running into problems. As I have in a sense with you guys, by not explaining this perhaps this way, it's one of the things that can get in the way. All right. So an illustration is, when it comes to math, I've seen this in myself when I got this later in life, and I see it with my son, and it just makes sense. When someone represents things tangibly, when it comes to mathematics, if someone can picture 10 as like 10 units, maybe 10 little 1-inch blocks in a row that all ends up to 10, and it can be split into 2 5s. It can be split into, of course, 8 little blocks and a 2. And you put them next to each other, and that's a 10 block. And then if you could think in terms of blocks of 10, and then they divide it again into units, and then you're making tens that way where you're adding. If you could think how multiplication involves making a square, right? You have 6 units in a square, like 6 actual little blocks that are 1 inch by 1 inch or 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, 6 or 7 across and 6 down. And then obviously there's 42 total blocks there. And the more tangibly you represent things, right? If you represent 26 times 4 and you think of 4 quarters like money and 4 pennies, then it's quickly easy to see that the answer to 26 times 4 is $1.04 or 104. Right? If someone doesn't represent it tangibly that way, then it's like 20. You have a squiggle for 2, that's a squiggle for 6, and that times 4, and you picture it like on paper, and you're like 6 times 4 is 4, carry the 2, right? And it's like much more tedious to do. So numbers, we could say, are concepts, but really what concepts are differences, right? But when we turn those differences, like the number 1 is a concept, but it's also a difference between having 0 and 1, having 1 or 2. You can think you can start to think about this. You can think of pretty much any concept in terms of it involves a distinction. It involves a difference between something and something else, like a boundary or the boundary around it. Turning those it's hard to think about differences directly. And so there's a wonderful way to do it, which is to turn the difference into an object. So the universe, even as a whole, is, to whatever degree we picture that, right? And what we picture is just something that's obviously a stand-in for the universe, right? If I say picture the universe, you can picture something, right? And you can feel something as you should. But what we picture is obviously not the actual universe, and it wouldn't be the same in everyone's case. Maybe it looks a little bit like a galaxy. I don't know what you picture, right? Like something like a representation of a galaxy or whatever. And then you add in the idea that it's really, I'm picturing everything when I do that, whatever. But when we look at what is the difference, what do I mean by the universe or any object or concept is a difference? It ends up being the difference between there not being anything or any kind of idea of the physical world versus there beings. I'm a bit quick there. Like we can go on and on about how to hone in on language describing the difference, but I'm just giving you an indication that's good enough regarding anything, the universe, whatever. A person, when you picture a person as an object, then once again, I talked before about the sledgehammer idea. If something changes, it's not the same, but there's certain differences when you start to get used to thinking this way when you need to. Person, again, we're so used to thinking in terms of a person as an object, which is very useful. Again, so I want to be clear. I'm not telling you to stop thinking in terms of objects. You definitely do want to think in terms of objects, but what we want to do is understand what we're doing when we think in terms of objects and how objects are literally representations of differences. And what we start to do is have these like layers where like a group of the group of white men, like white men in general, is like an object that's a group of objects. It's abstraction, it's a group of objects in another sense. So we also make objects out of groups of objects, just like a tree is an object or a particular tree is an object, but we also think of it as a group of atoms, which are also objects, right? And then there's words for relationships between objects. Remember, objects themselves are mental objects. They're real in a different sense. And then we have words that describe relationships between mental objects. And all together, it ends up forming what we can call a reality construct. I might use the word reality construct in slightly different ways. I haven't really honed it perfectly in that sense, but that's okay for now. It won't create a problem yet. As it does, then we could just make more distinctions as we need to. But for now, a little bit like I can use the mind as I'm speaking. I could say your mind does this, your mind does that. We don't need to know exactly what that means in order to talk and to start thinking about it. And that's actually how objects are, is we think in a sense, because the way people normally think about objects is they feel like they're real in a way that they're not. And then they feel like they're made up of things in a way that they're not. Then again, they think that they're objective in a way that they're not. And they think they can do things in a way that they can't. I've in the past pointed out how you can have objects on a computer screen and in a computer game as well. You can have it on a screensaver where it's not actually a game, right? You can have a screensaver of a person or a cartoon figure swinging a baseball bat, like having a cartoon pitcher throwing a ball at a cartoon baseball player with a bat, and the baseball player with the bat hits the ball and it goes in an arc, right? You could obviously have a screensaver of that. Wouldn't have to be a computer game. But when you looked at that, there'd be a bunch of objects, right? The ball, the pitcher, the batter, the bat. We can have a word for the arc of the ball. We could say the ball goes in an arc. We could say that if it was represented with the whole stadium and it went over the back wall, we could say that it was a home run. Because if we saw people on bases and there was 3 people on base and we saw the home run, we could say it was a grand slam, another object. When we picture that on a screensaver, we understand that those objects are not real in a certain sense and they can't do anything. And yet we can, if that screensaver picture, or of course we could have a movie, either animated or real, right, with real actors and so forth. We're representing the same type of thing I just talked about, right? You have a baseball game, you can have people on base, you could have a hit and the ball goes in the arc and all that. That could be in a movie, right? In the movie, it would be a little bit differently real, right? It's a little easier to see with something animated where we could say they're not real and they can't, the objects within that animation can't do anything, right? You can draw anything you want in an animation. It gets a little bit more complicated for people when they think about if it was a movie where it was real actors, then we would say that the ball traveled because the object, the baseball bat, and the object, the hitter, hit the ball. And yet, interestingly enough, if it was an animated film, then we could easily see that none of the objects were actually causing anything to happen. Everything was drawn. Although we might say that the object that is the cartoonist, right, the animator or the CGI programmer these days, whatever, that they are the objects that made everything happen. But by thinking in terms of the animation, we could start to remove ourselves a little bit from real life in a way that we can start to see how you could have a situation where objects don't actually do anything. And yet they could be used for representations. And if the cartoonist is mimicking real life, we could use the part of the animation to accurately predict the rest of the animation, right? And we can answer questions like, how many runs did the offense just score, right, in baseball? And if there were 3 runners on base, they had a home run, that'd be 4, right? We can answer that correctly. All without the objects actually being real. And that's in life, we can function as if objects are real, right? Except that there's all kinds of problems you run into daily, deeply, and on the surface. And one of the types of problems you run into is an inflexibility of thought and representation, and taking things overly seriously, taking arbitrary things as foundational and non-arbitrary. Constantly, you're running into this problem for yourself day by day, topic by topic, issue by issue in your life. You, I've helped you to some degree, very possibly, and you might be very far along in helping to not have your mind control you in the same way because of the whole arbitrary idea that I've talked about. But as you get this, it'll give you a major frame that's going to make it easier where you're not really struggling to feel that things are arbitrary. Sorry, that representations are arbitrary. Now, I'm in no way, obviously, because what I'm saying is correct. Of course, I'm asserting that, but I'm not talking about solipsism or that our mind creates reality or anything like that. What our mind does do, again, is create objects. And if you think about it, in your existing worldview, you already, in one manner, we have a whole bunch of contradictions in our existing worldview, just the normal way that we think about perception and how the world works. You can understand the idea that your mind creates a tree. If you look at a particular tree, your own worldview is that it's mostly either electrons or protons and neutrons or atoms, molecules, depending on your knowledge or number of years in chemistry, right? And then you get to where you're taught that electrons don't really exist even as objects. They're more like probability fields, and it gets more and more complex as you get closer to quantum physics and so forth, or the more detailed you get with what's really going on with atoms and parts of atoms. So there's all kinds of probability fields in terms of electrons and protons and neutrons and fundamental forces and mostly empty space. And that's already in our worldview, what I just described, right? When you look at a tree, and yet your mind doesn't show you that, right? It creates an object that's the tree, and it represents a certain difference, not the difference between, that tree doesn't involve the molecules in terms of differences, right? It doesn't show you 99% empty space, for example, with the tree. It looks like it's all solid, which is a correct difference, such as if you walk into a tree, you're not going to feel like you're walking into 99% empty space. It's going to function as if it's solid, right? Which is a real difference. Like the difference between walking into a tree and walking 3 meters to the right, where you don't walk into the tree, 3 meters to the right, where there's no obstructions. I'm stipulating. You just keep walking straight forward, right? And there's no obstruction, nothing physical or solid. If you were to walk right into the tree, then it would be solid. That's a difference. So functionally, there's a difference where it functions as if it's purely solid versus if you don't walk into the tree, you walk past it to the right of it, then it functions if it's purely not solid. Even though when you walk past the tree, you're walking into a ton of air molecules, right? Again, according to the normal worldview. And the normal worldview isn't incorrect. It's just contained thought errors. I'm not saying there aren't air molecules. I'm saying that whether or not there are, that our basic understanding of the nature of mental objects and objects, but I'm not, of course, the worldview of chemistry and physics overlaps with reality in a useful way, is one way to put it. I'm not disputing it. I'm not saying that science is wrong. I'm saying that our philosophy is wrong. We don't understand the relationship between our thought and the physical world. And therefore, and our thoughts about the physical world, we don't understand how critical in terms of our interaction with the world, both physical and emotional and mental and social and all that. And a lot of our responses and our decisions and our actions are based on our mental representation of the world, right? Whether you decide to go start your own business isn't really limited by molecules or not, right? It's not affected by your understanding of molecules. Your representation of the world and your beliefs and your responses that you think are useful, what you think is important in the world and so forth. That's all coming from your own mental construct. It has a massive functional impact on what you choose to do and therefore what you physically do, right? All right. So what we want to do is understand what objects are, what they can and can't do, how they're useful, and what typical thought people have about objects that are incorrect, and also ones that what they're when and how that's not useful to thinking correctly about objects. The following is not necessarily the most immediately practical thing that people run into, but when you're trying to define things or understand things like money, love, sales, whatever, then another person, then instead of asking what something is, and you're also not going to ask what is it not, you're going to try to understand it in terms of how is this concept, what is it the difference between? What is love the difference between? Rather than what is love, as if it's an object or a conceptual type of object, a concept that can be defined as a positive thing, like a positive in the sense of a photo negative versus a positive. In one kind of useful, potentially useful metaphor regarding objects, to think of them as like a, I guess, a photo positive or photo negative. But when you take a normal photo, I don't know how it works with cell phones and digital stuff, but the old photos, there would be like a negative, and from the negative, a positive would be. Anyway, there's a way to that metaphor for an object in a sense, where again, like a block, like a 1 centimeter and 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter block to represent the digit one, the new, or not the digit, but the concept one, right? And then like a block of 10 of those to represent the idea of 10. That's like kind of a photo positive, right? For the concept, which is it. Again, concepts and objects or mental objects are differences. And then we put something in there that feels real and tangible and mentally tangible. And that's important and useful to work with differences. Working with differences directly without turning them into objects is too difficult. Just like when math doesn't click for a person, it's because they're not turning math concepts into photo positives, into objects that are tangible. But what we want to be able to do is make our objects better and clearer and work with them well. We want to be able to do with life what's good in math, where we work well with objects, but we also keep in mind that objects are representations of the math concepts or other concepts, but they're not, they're representations of differences, and the differences are more real. And then we can understand that neither the different nor the object that's a mental representation, like a kind of a tangible mental representation of a difference. That's all an object is fundamentally. Neither of those can do things. The difference between 1 and 2, right? If I have one pear, like the fruit, and there's a difference if I have two pears between having one or two. If I go to the cashier, then they'll charge me more. If I go to eat them, then I'll get to eat two pears rather than one. If I have two rather than one. So there's one difference, or that can manifest itself in all sorts of different ways between having one pear and two pears, right? So the difference functionally causes ripple effects of differences, right? In terms of how much I pay, how much I can, how many people I can share it with, whatever, I'm giving them a full pear. But the difference doesn't do anything. The difference can't get up and slap me in the face. The difference between one pair and two pairs can't slap me in the face. The universe and a person's body and a person's mind even can't do anything. Now it's more complex, and we have so many associations in our mind as if objects can do things. Now, it's perfectly reasonable to think of objects as doing stuff. Like it's reasonable to think of a bat as hitting a ball, and that's why the ball flies up in the air. And that'll help you adjust your grip, right, and so forth. Just like I talk about how in a video game, it's useful to think of yourself as really the person in the video game that you're controlling, right? Your video game character. When you're driving, in one sense, thinking of yourself as your car is completely useful, right? But then it stops being useful wherever it's being used. And we need to always be a split second, so to speak, away from stopping and realizing like that objects aren't real. So we can think of objects as real in a useful way. But then whenever that's going to create a problem, we need to instantly step back. And we do that already with movies. You can get into a movie and feel like it's real and feel the emotions and so forth. But the minute your kid has an injury and is bleeding, then you take your kid and you rush to the hospital or whatever you do, right? You don't keep staying immersed in the movie as if it's real, right? Maybe your kid has a non-life threatening emergency, but James Bond is in a life threatening situation. Normally, a life threatening situation, all things being equal, might take precedence over a non-life threatening, right? But if one of them is in a movie, then all of a sudden there's a huge difference. And even if James Bond is in a life threatening situation, you can still pause or turn off the movie and drive your kid or attend to your kid if they even have a significant boo or whatever, right? They need some attention. You stop with the movie. So it's actually not complicated to figure out when to stop thinking of a movie as real, as long as it's easy to figure that out once you're aware of a movie for what a movie is. And again, it's useful to get immersed in a movie, and it's useful to be able to, on a moment's notice, get unimmersed in a movie. It's useful to think of objects being able to do things and cause car crashes and so forth. Right up, it's useful to think of yourself as your car and have far nougat, right? And identify with your car and a oneness with your car in the road until it's not useful, right? For all kinds of reasons, you might not want to think that your car in certain situations. When we're trying to understand about consciousness and creation and so forth, and fundamentally how things work, then we need to understand that the universe can't do anything or make it. I don't necessarily think I've proven that case for someone that's so immersed in it that it feels real to them. It's going to continue to feel real. You have all these associations, and you've used the idea that objects are real functionally for your whole life, probably. But what I can start to do is give you a kind of a crack in the wall, right? Or a thread to start pulling on and pull with you for the course of this webinar. With the sledgehammer idea that if something changes, it's not the same thing, that can start to give us an indication that something's wrong when we think that objects are real and the same thing, and yet they're out there. Right? If an object has a real existence, if a person is real in a kind of foundational way, or if a person as an object has an independent existence, then something's off that we can't reconcile, because we both think that the person is the same person today and yesterday, right? Even if we deny that, oh no, they're different today than yesterday, we use the same freaking word to refer. We use the same concept and space in our mind to think about them. There's a way that we absolutely imply and act as if our friend is the same thing as today and yesterday, right? Obviously. If Mike calls me up, I don't say, oh, who's this? I'm like, oh, I knew Mike yesterday. That person's changed. It doesn't exist anymore, right? So who are you? That would be nonsense. So we have to imply that they're the same thing, but that's not possible given the normal way of looking at objects. This should be a glimpse into how we start to figure out that there's something wrong with our frame. When there's an impossible contradiction that we can't get out of, where I can't think of a particular person as either the same or as different. It's absurd if I were to act as if Mike no longer existed and there's a new thing in his place, right? That would be absurd to try to act on that and talk based on that and think based on that. At the same time, it's clearly absurd to deny that if something changes, it isn't the same thing. Obviously, if something changes, it no longer exists. It's not the same thing, right? To say that something can change and be the same thing is just trying to mash two sides of a contradiction together. Like starting to say, of course there's a married bachelor. Look at Joe. He's a married bachelor and he's standing right here. You can have a person, the person can really be standing there. You can point to them, shake their hand and say they're a married bachelor. And the fact that you can shake their hand and poke them and talk to them doesn't make it true that someone can both be married and not married at the same time. The fact that you can try to affirm that then a person both changes and is the same person doesn't make it correct. It has to be incorrect. It's a contradiction. So when both sides of a contradiction both seem like they have to be true, then there's something wrong with your frame. And in this case, the frame would have to do with something deep about how you think and view the world and represent the world. Something about your mental construct for reality and your very understanding of your words is deeply and fundamentally off, right? If both sides of that contradiction of a person being the same and not the same at the same time in the same relationship seems correct. And this is I'm showing you where the issue is. I'm not saying I successfully showed you where the issue is, but I'm talking about where the issue is. Since I used Mike as an example, then his body is made up of real stuff, right? That affects the world, the molecules, and then he has a brain and a mind, and there's real ideas in that mind, and they're all real in a certain sense. But in a way of thinking about it, the fundamental parts are real, and they're real, again, as I've talked about before, as reason. To make an object out of Mike, which Mike himself does in his view of himself, and that I do, and that the rest of us do who know Mike, and of course we could use anybody, is a construct of our mind, right? There's a bunch of, in essence, fundamental particles or pieces that are grouped together, and then there's a photopositive made of those things. It's like a representation of the whole. And that representation only exists in our mind. The various pieces exist in some way, shape, or form out there, outside of my mind. Those various pieces cohere, right? They don't operate disparately or, with no coherence to them, of course. Mike's fingers and toes and different neurons in his brain and ideas in his mind work coherently to a certain degree. They're integrated. And then, but that would have to be imposed, that integration has to be imposed on it from another mind. Right? And that would relate to God and so forth. This is so contrary to our worldview in a certain sense. It's a little hard to, of course, talk about. I run into a bunch of issues everywhere I turn when I try to explain more. Let me take a look at what I wrote here. So I wrote that they can't do anything. Like my concepts in my mind, my objects in my mind that are representations of the world, they're not even really representations, right? Because they are and they aren't. So if I had a particular tree that's outside my window, let's say, and I call that tree Bob the tree, right? Then Bob the tree becomes a specific object in my mind. That object in my mind can't grow leaves. Now, there's something outside in a sense, right? Outside that's in some sense growing leaves. And in another way of speaking, the object in my mind can grow leaves. Let's say Bob didn't have leaves, and then I looked at it and Bob was growing leaves, then my representation grew leaves. But it didn't grow leaves in the sense of from photosynthesis and so forth. Just the mental representation added leaves, or maybe added the idea of growing the leaves and then the leaves are there. And then you say, well, what's the relationship between that mental object and the physical world or the real world? Our mind makes the object for us, right? And there's some amount of practical and functional overlap between Bob the tree in my mind and something going on out there in what I call the world of reason, right? And what overlaps with what people think of as the physical. There's something going on there in the physical world, the world of reasons, that overlaps with my mental object, Bob the tree. Now, we already think of what's going on out there in two kind of ways that are different. One is that there's really a tree just like Bob the tree looks like in my mind. People using naive realism, they think of that tree just like that being outside. But they also think, as I pointed out, that there's something with 99% plus empty space that's all made of molecules that makes up Bob the tree as well. And that idea contrasts with our mental image, our visual and mental image of the tree, of Bob the tree, which doesn't contain 99% empty space, even though we also believe that Bob the tree does contain 99% plus empty space. And I think everyone knows what I mean when I say 99% space, but the normal, and I'm not saying incorrect, the normal view that I agree with, as long as it's represented properly by understanding how our mental objects work. But the normal view that I don't dispute, chemistry and physics, is that pretty much all the physical objects that we're aware of are made of atoms that go together to make molecules. and the atoms are composed of more smaller particles. And if you look at the atom itself with the electrons and protons and neutrons, it's nearly all empty space. The protons and neutrons are very tiny. Electrons are very tiny compared to the overall size of the atom. And then same thing with the molecule as a whole. And so that's what I mean when I say that in one sense, we already think of the tree as being nearly all empty space, and yet our representation of it doesn't take that into account, which isn't a problem necessarily, but it shows that there's some odd thing going on with the reality of Bob the tree, which is the reality of Bob the tree. We functionally think and act typically as if the reality matched our kind of visual and mental concept right of the surface. It's only when we stop and have to think of it in terms of molecules and 99% empty space that we do that. We normally don't even think of it. Operates in a different mental space, right? For us, like only when we're thinking about physics and stuff. But by having a reason I point out both realities that people believe about the tree, both that it looks like on the surface and that it also is made up of molecules and mostly empty space, those are in one sense irreconcilable. Right? I get that people do smash them together and believe both. And I don't dispute that they're both have correct, but there's a way that you can pause and say, well, that's odd. I think and act as if I'm seeing the tree the way it really is. And yet I also believe it's 99% empty space. And yet the way that I feel like the tree really is no empty space. It's just a solid, hard object. Okay. So the reason I talked about that just now, the last few minutes, was in dealing with the question of what does our mental object of Bob the tree represent? And I pointed out that there's two very different ways that we think of Bob the tree, the kind of naive way and then the way based on physics. And then, well, so the idea of representing it, you're really looking, when we're looking at representing Bob the tree and anything else, we're looking at usefulness rather than accuracy. Because accuracy dissolves that into nonsense. We can't ever really check our accuracy anyway, because all we have is like feedback from the outside world. We can't observe it directly. We can't see how it really is, because seeing literally means mixing your perspective with it. And even again, in our kind of physics view of the world, seeing means bouncing, in essence, bouncing light waves off of it or processing photons that are emitted from electrons changing orbitals and so forth. And then there's also electromagnetic interactions when we physically touch something. That's an electromagnetic reaction in van der Waals forces and so on and so forth. But when we touch it, then our pushing it and interacting with it with electromagnetic forces primarily. So in every way, we're interacting with it. We can't see it for what it really is. We only can mix and push and bounce things. You know what I'm saying? We're affecting it. That's how we have the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, for example, is you're banging things into what you're looking at in that sense, which affects them. So we can figure this out logically, but I'm pointing out that even through physics, the same conclusion is essentially reached, where there's no such thing as directly observing in a kind of an unbiased or non-perspective way the physical world. There's no way to compare our representation with the reality of it, or the accuracy of it, or the fundamental nature of it. Instead, all we're left with is usefulness. Now, but we have a whole nother thing. How's that forgetting? We have another thing, which is, as we look then at the usefulness of our mental object, we can do what I talked about in the past, where I talked about creating scenarios, stipulating alchemy, dealing with mental objects, adding to them, adjusting them. When we can view mental objects as mental objects, that actually strips away a ton of the confusion. Because when I understand Bob the tree to be a mental object only, now be careful. When I say Bob the tree as a mental object only, I'm talking about when I'm thinking about Bob the tree, manipulating what's going on in my own mind. Of course, again, there's a reality out there that overlaps or interacts with. I'm not saying there's no reality out there that is relevant to Bob the tree. There is. Okay. Again, I'd say it's in the world of reasons, but it's the same as you picture this with a computer screen. There's a reason why in that animation I talked about of the baseball players and the bat and the ball, there's a reality behind it. There's computer processing and code behind the ball appearing on your screensaver or an animated movie playing on your computer screen, right? When I say that it's just stuff on your computer screen, that's not true. There's underlying code and process. There's reasons for it. Similarly, there's stuff outside in the outside world, the physical world, the world of reason that is related to Bob the Tree. And I'm not denying that. However, what we can do when we're thinking is once we don't, what we can do is temporarily or in an isolated way. We don't need to get caught up at all in outside reality. And we can think only in terms of mental objects. And that actually helps us think much more accurately because we can stipulate, suppose things, and see what would happen. I'll refer to an example. I've used something similar in the past. If we're thinking of a business plan or a marketing plan based on a budget of $10,000, then if we're trying to do that and we're worried about whether we really have $10,000, that only is going to interfere with thinking about what we would do with $10,000 and examining that scenario. Like if we were talking about how we might spend $10,000 and that was the point of the discussion, we really wanted to figure that out. And if someone in the group that was discussing that said, but I don't know if we really have $10,000, that would only muddy the waters in an unuseful way. It might be useful for a different question and in a different situation, then it might be very relevant when we actually have $10,000. But while we're trying to think about what we would do with $10,000, it's wholly irrelevant, distracting, and confusing and muddying to bring up whether there's really $10,000 in the bank account. It's totally irrelevant if we're doing a mental exercise trying to think what we would do with $10,000. Do you see that? It's critically important for thinking. You're going to find that it's much easier to think about things in an accurate way when we can temporarily stop connecting our mental objects with and blurring them with some supposed reality out there. If we can't distinguish between the mental object Bob the tree and this real thing out there, and normally people blur all that together and they think of Bob the tree as both, and like they think about him in their head, and then they think that there's a real tree out there, and that again, functionally speaking, they're all blurred together. Or if you think about love, people think about like it actually existing out there in the world while they're thinking about it as a mental object, and it only interferes. And it's going to be so much easier, I think. It's way easier for me. And the only reason it wouldn't be easier, either didn't get this concept, something else is messing with you, we have to figure out. But probably it'll be radically easier for you to just think. And when I say think, figure out what to do with that $10,000 budget or whatever. Like you can think through scenarios so much easier when your incorrect, basically, idea of the real world or this naive or confused view of the real world keeps interfering with your stipulations and scenarios. You can also have much more mental flexibility because when you understand that your reality construct, which is your mental objects and groups of those objects and relationships between those objects and all sorts of stuff like that, associations, is just trying to usefully overlap with the world rather than getting it confused with that it is the real world, but it's also, I guess, you're thinking about it and it's your thoughts that you're thinking about, but at the same time, you're thinking about reality. It's confusing and wrong to think that way. Instead, you can do two things better when you have the right distinctions. You can think through scenarios better. Like you can stipulate and say, all right, if I have this sales presentation, if they put me in this category, if they're thinking this way, if they're ready to buy, or if they know that they want to buy, they want to spend a certain amount on advertising. And this is a good example. So what if you're trying to think through whether a prospective client that you're going to pitch, right? And you're thinking, what if they view things the following way? They have an advertising budget and they're thinking of how to allocate it. And I want to talk to them from that angle. Now, that's a useful train of thought to develop and come up with a plan that will be effective, or at least your best plan your best guess of what will be effective if they think that way. What happens with a lot of people when they're trying to think about that is their mind gets confused and diverted and blurred because they start thinking whether or not the person really will end up thinking that way. But hopefully, as I give this example, and of course, if you don't see it, then just take time for the framework to build and work on it. I want to say hopefully, but hope ideally, whatever, eventually, or maybe right now, you'll see that thoughts about whether the person really will view things that way are only interfering and distracting and confusing from developing a plan for if they do think that way. We've got to be able to think in terms of if then, if this, then that. If this happens, then what will I do? If this happens, then what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? And then what do I do? Maybe a succession of ripple effects and steps and a logical tree of different things. And it's so much easier to think in terms of if and then, which is critically necessary for thinking and developing plans and developing responses. You might not often think of things as plans, but you're planning your various responses, right, to things. And if you don't plan them, then it just happens based on associations in the moment, right? And when you're thinking about your frames and what you want your frames to be, what categories you want to be thinking in and putting that person in and all kinds of stuff, then being able to stipulate and think without constantly blurring in how things quote unquote really are, that's just a separate issue, right? If you have a bunch of if thens, think about it functionally and practically. If you're able to think about a bunch of if thens and what you'll do if the prospect thinks this way, if the prospect says this, if they have this issue in their head, if they put me in this category, but if I want them to be in this other, put me in this other category, right? And then you think about those things accurately, then functionally speaking, you're going to do a great job functionally and relatively speaking to not doing that, you're going to do a great job in your sales presentation, right? That's all going to be useful. Worrying about what they'll actually do or conjecturing or extrapolating or supposing or expecting what they're going to actually do is going to interfere with your thought process. And I see it all the time with people. They get confused about stipulating because they start to think about, but I don't think that's really going to be the thing. But I don't know if, yeah, of course you don't know if. That's why we're stipulating and we're trying to get our thoughts straight regarding one possibility that we can take into account if it's different. But in each case, we want to think accurately and do the if then and carry the logic forward. A lot of people, they literally can't carry logic forward, right? They can't do the thing with extortion. They just get stuck. They're like, but can't people contribute something? I'm like, what? What does that have to do with carrying one thought straight, like through and seeing where it leads? We want to make I wrote here, we want to make our representations or objects better. There's two things. So I was saying there's two things going on. One is we want to be able to carry forward if then scenarios, right? Stipulations. If something's a certain way, then what does that mean? And how, and what are conclusions? And if things are a certain way and I add an extra element, right? What if we're talking about this and then they bring in this issue? Now I add that into my scenario and I go from there. I don't worry about whether it'll actually happen, right? In my mind, I'm playing with concepts. These concepts exist as mental objects and I'm working with them. If we're doing math and we say, what's three apples and 4 apples? And someone says, I don't know if the store has that many apples. Like, what the freak? What are you talking about? But in practice, people do that kind of thing all the time. It's crazy, but they do it. And it's very common. The answer is 7 apples. It doesn't matter what the store has. It could matter separately if the store has it, or if you're running the store and you want to make sure you have enough stuff in stock. But first you need to add the apples properly, and then you want to represent things right. Okay, so what I mean when I say we want our representations to be better regarding, let's say, love, or regarding sales, right? A sales presentation. Our mind creates an object for doing a sales presentation as a whole, right? Or white men as a group, or love as a concept or an experience or whatever, as a thing, right? And it forms its object out of a whole bunch of association, right? Experiences and so forth, and then biases in terms of what's filtered in and what's noticed and what's important. But ultimately, it's making a hodgepodge of association. And that's what love is, right? And someone might never run into a person that they really match with romantically that's really effortless and wonderful for the most part. And so their idea of what love is comes from a bunch of associations that doesn't take that into account but you can revamp your idea of what love is and think, what is it the difference between, instead of it being a whole bunch of associations made into an object as the end of the story, right? We can have that, and we do have that for most every object and concept and group of objects and so forth. But what we can do is when they come up and they're relevant and they're an important frame that might be relevant to what we're doing, right? Like sales. Like, what is sales? Or more specific things. What is an objection and how is that handled? If our intuitive object of an objection is something that makes us tense up and get confused and defensive, or wanting to placate, wanting to not, if we have an object of like an aggressive salesperson, we don't want to be that person. If we're a woman and we feel like we don't want men to act aggressively towards us, right? In certain ways, and we have that fresh in our mind where someone's pushing, we don't like that. And then we go to try to do sales, right? And if our mind puts those two objects as one kind of thing, overall thing, and blurs them together, and then we're mostly trying to not do that. I'm not saying anyone's actually doing this. I'm not trying to stereotyping women. I'm just creating an example. Again, I'm not blurring reality with what I'm talking about. I'm simply creating a stipulation. I'm taking a number of ingredients and showing you what you can get out of those ingredients in this way, in a unuseful way, what those ingredients can unusefully mix and lead to. And so as a practical matter, if those ingredients get mixed, then we want to unmix them and we want to mix our ingredients in a useful way, right? And we can understand that sales is not the same thing. It can certainly overlap in a lot of ways with dating. And there's a lot of useful things to be done, especially if you're good at dating. Probably, especially as a guy, just given realistic roles realistically in the world, then if a guy understands how to date effectively, interact with women in an effective way where they're generally not being threatened, but you're reasonably persuasive and so on and so forth. If you think about it in terms of getting yourself in the right categories and not triggering the wrong categories, those are all useful overlaps between dating and sales. But if your experiences and roles that you play regarding dating are overlapping in a non-useful way, then you want to distinguish and not have those objects blurred together as one thing intuitively or whatever, right? And you want to be able to be properly aggressive with sales in a way that isn't aggressive in a way that's backfiring, right? But there's certain distinctions we need to make with sales where in a certain way aggression is useful and either comes across like you believe in yourself and the product, and in a certain way it's not. So again, we want to have our representations of these objects, sales presentation, sales as a whole, aggression in sales is like a concept, which is like an object in a sense, or relationships between objects. But relationships between objects becomes its own object in a sense. The more positively and tangibly you can represent these things, the more you can work with them, right? And what you want them to do is overlap with reality in a useful way. That means good for other people. It means good for us. It means our responses are more accurate, more pragmatic, right? And so forth. When objects take on a foundational reality in our mind incorrectly, then we can't play with them and distinguish with them and adjust them very well because we think that they have an independent reality in a way that they don't. Again, they overlap with an independent reality in the world of reason and so forth, right? There really are sales presentations, right? Sales interactions really do exist, of course, right? Outside of your mind. But your representations are just representations, and the overlap needs to be useful. And the more you represent sales in a way that's purely useful for you, and the more you represent various aspects of a sale, various categories of a sale, various frames and responses and specific objections and the idea of objections as a whole, right? The more you see what I'm saying in this webinar, the more we're unblocked from thinking that we're denying reality. And instead, we're just trying to get, again, our mental objects are mental objects. There's no such thing as a real object. There's such thing as external reality, but think of it for the moment. A useful representation of external reality is like a combination of code and like swirling fundamental particles. All right. They swirl with physical law and other laws, right? There's a regularity to how the particles interact. The universe out there is state dependent, which means that the configuration of particles is dependent on the previous configuration of particles and then various laws and stuff, right? But when you see the world is fundamentally a bunch of fundamental particles that are changing and reconfiguring, is a better way to put it, based on some regularities and so forth. But then what people have is minds that create objects out of gross differences, gross meaning kind of holistic, right? Differences, right? A car is made up of a bunch of fundamental particles, right? Which kind of exist as these particles themselves are made up of reasons or code or something like that, right? They're not necessarily physical in the way that people think of, but thinking of them as physical is a fine representation, like any representation, and can overlap usefully. That's it. Anyhow, your car is made up of fundamental particles. There's still a gross difference that's useful in seeing the car as a whole, right? And representing the car as a whole. But that whole, again, it has a real life usefulness, that whole has a, the whole as a whole has a real life overlap, but ultimately it's an object that's in your mind, that whole. And when you can shift to viewing the world as made up of these fundamental particles, and that objects are imposed on those fundamental particles because of gross movements and coherence in those particles, but you can mix and match and categorize however you want, right? We can see this with groups of people. You can create all sorts of categories and groups of people, both overall with the traditional genders and races and specific countries, religions, all sorts of stuff, right? Think of it like you're in a sales presentation. There's all sorts of groups that you guys have in common. You're both human. You might be the same gender. You might not be. You might be the same religion, same overall race. You might be from a different country. One of you might be more Italian. One of you might be more French in the context of overall white, brown, yellow, whatever the hell, right? People to pick up. Then you guys are both white, right? Subtle things that refer to that might be helpful. Maybe you're both Southern and you have a little bit of a Southern implication to your carriage and communication and countenance, right? That's a thing that subtly or not so subtly evokes a shared group. My point here is that there's all these fundamental particles, so to speak, and that can be grouped in all kinds of different ways, right? Depending on how you group people or what group they're currently identifying with, right? Again, human, American, white, or whatever other race, or from country of origin rather than race, gender, whether you're freaking cis or trans or not, straight, bi, whatever the heck, right? What color hair, right? Religion, hobbies, business people versus non, right? However many differences I might have with Donald Trump, I feel a kinship overall when I think about government because he's fundamentally more of a person who creates and is a business person and entrepreneur rather than a government person who judges things, sees the world very different, right? In terms of government, people see things much more as you make a certain amount of income. I see things as you don't make any income until and unless you do something that year or week or month. Anyway, but we can, depending on what we focus on, we can see things different ways. It's the same thing overall with what's going on in your day or people or objects or whatever. You make objects by how you define and group and what differences you focus on. Then an object emerges, literally, right, in your mind. And then again, and groupings of objects, how your day is going, whether things are going well, right, is what differences are being focused on. There's an underlying reality, but there's no reality typically dictating which differences and therefore which boundaries and contrasts and therefore which photo negatives or which objects you say are happening, right? And you feel are more real or more relevant. So therefore, as you view life more and view the world in your mind, and your interaction with the world, your representation of the world that way, objects are so much more fluid and your thoughts are so much more fluid and accurate. And it becomes all about getting your representations more accurate rather than the usual trying to prove by that they're already accurate. And that you're already standing, right? Your representations of objects, your mental objects, you're always constantly standing on various ones of those, right? When you think. And your actions and responses and your speech and everything and your physical movements are based on what you think, right? So your representation of objects is something you're constantly standing on in order to do the rest of your life. Mundane, practical, deep, whatever. You're using them to think, therefore to respond, therefore to choose what action that you're doing, to choose what tasks to do, what's important, and so forth. The more both accurate and fluid, the more strength where it should be strong and the more flexibility you have regarding mental objects and therefore thought and thinking, you're far better off. Cool. I think that's a good way to wrap up this part, and I'll be happy to discuss it for a bit now. And then I think I'm getting to the point where I might open up these webinars again to whoever wants to come on them and do overall discussion of anything that I've talked about or that you want to talk about. It can be fair game. And as usual, if I think of something during the week, like I done every single week so far, then I'll be happy to talk about it. Okay, let me take a moment. Look, thanks with my avocado thing. Okay. Wow, lots of several comments. We take a look here. That's great. I'm done. Said, I'm making my bank account into a negative so I can learn to make it positive. That's pretty funny. This is very hard to comprehend. Maybe it's simple. Yeah, it's totally natural and normal if this was difficult so far to process. But I think you've probably gotten glimpses. And I think as I continued, I got to certain points or ideas that will be helpful and it'll help you build this. So I'm pretty happy with how this unfolded. I do not think that I've necessarily fully won the battle or the war with everybody with what I've said, but I think I'm glad of a number of things that come out and distinctions that are illustrations and so forth. Matt says, given your track record with success building OMG, going through all of your conversion training throughout LOI material multiple times, I've always had a sense your understanding of conversion must be very deep and comprehensive and not just surface level tactical. For people to consume your training, you're needing to convince them to overhaul their entire belief system that exists. Now things work, but only because that's the most useful thing, because it's actually efficient to do that. And Matt goes on to say, they have to go off their local peak, right? Referring to that metaphor, that illustration, down into a valley and climb an entirely different peak. They have no method defined. It can't yet see. All of which looks like massive negative progress. Selling consumption of LOI goes directly against what people think they want, doesn't necessarily have much perceived value, and is very counterintuitive to seek understanding. And it is very counterintuitive to seek understanding, like swimming up a river against the current. There's also no certification or sense of closure that people seem to expect with traditional education courses or other training. Overall, it's still mind-blowing to me whenever I think about it, because it's one thing to sell something to people they know they want. Oh, that's funny. So what Matt's referring to here is that the sales job that I have and that you guys often have when you're I know you guys try to talk about this to people as well and successfully, it's the best exercise or the hardest thing to lift and the best muscle building thing. I really have to figure out conversion, right? Because like selling something to people that they know they want, or that these kind of one frame you have to switch that's in their ability to switch and then they want it, is radically different than trying to sell. Yeah, exactly. It's one of the most difficult sales jobs. The cool thing about LOI is, and the reason why we'll win, is that when someone gets it, they're not going to go back. And that's actually more important than however hard it is. And when they get on the peak, they'll stay there. However hard it is to get people over to the right peak, metaphorically speaking, that can be done. It's hard, but it can be done. And what isn't going to happen is people are going to go back, right? Various religions and philosophies and political philosophies, it might be relatively easy to get someone thinking that way, but they're not solid. They're not correct and clear and foundational and knowable, so people can go in and out of. So you don't ever win. You just fight back and forth. With LOI, it's effort to get on the right current, get on the right peak, but we get so we got. By the way, LOI has massive perceived value to me. Right now, that was clear. And tremendous actual value also, more than I could ever imagine. That's wonderful to hear, Matt. I appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate you writing it where we can cut and paste it and put it somewhere. That's great. Thank you very much. Oh, as many of you have done. Overall, it's still, just to finish what you wrote, overall, it's still mind-blowing to me whenever I think about it, because it's one thing to sell something to people they know they want. It's an entirely different level of difficulty to sell something to people where so much is rigged against you. Yeah. And it's also why I'm spending so many years working on that, because it's not something that I'm accomplishing instantly. Lawrence says, what if you have two guys probably in a state where gay marriage is allowed, but doesn't yet apply in other states? Right. Correct. You can always, of course, you're being lighthearted here. It lets me say that you can always, when I talk about the law of non-contradiction, a good way to express it is to say that two things like P and not P, right? Like little zip P, little whatever it is, P. I can't remember the name of that mark. But P and not P, like a statement and its opposite, like the sidewalk is wet and the sidewalk is not wet. those statements can't both be true at the same time and in the same relationship is one way to put it. If you, of course, change the relationship or the kind of the meaning of one of the two sides of the contradiction, then you can make them both true. Lawrence demonstrated here. And of course, again, I'm not criticizing Lawrence, who's being lighthearted here and having fun, but it lets me point that out, that two sides of a contradiction can never be true. You can quote unquote make them true by changing the meaning of one of the two sides and not changing the other meaning. Kind of having the same word refer to two different meanings, of course, can make anything true. But of course, doing that makes thought and not possible when you change the meaning of words. Roberto says, that's the payoff of this webinar for me right now. Don't blur mental objects with a supposed outside world. Yeah, that was a really cool takeaway. I'm glad you called that out. And I'm glad it occurred to me to explain that in that way. When I say I'm glad, I'm literally like, it comes from me, like any thoughts from our mind. It's not me, right? I do what I do, but then I never know exactly what's going to come into my mind and out of my mouth. And sometimes when things come out, they sound input to me. And sometimes when they come out, I'm like, oh, cool, that's how. And sometimes not the. So when I say that I like when something comes out in a certain way, then literally, that's what I mean. I see it all, the good, the bad, the ugly. But that one was a good, very helpful and practical. People do it all the time. And a lot of these things I point out, if you keep them in your mind, you'll see them throughout the week, as I say, and you'll see them more often. Roberto says, so are you suggesting after planning, using the model you just did by representing mental objects correctly, that we then execute that plan out in the quote unquote real world? A lot of plans are like, if this happens, then I'll do this. Or you're stipulating, it looks like things are this way. So given that, I'm going to go do the following. Ideally, I'll get the result I want. If not, I'll assess at that point. Or you might be able to actually plan what you'll do if things don't work out ideally. Or you might be able to guess at like a secondary result that might happen that's not ideal. And you plan what'll happen then. And then if neither of those things happen, neither the ideal nor the secondary thing that you guess will happen, then you say, then I can assess at the time. Anyway, Roberto gives an example of what he means. He says, example, I'm creating a sales presentation. I'm thinking using if-then scenarios. And in that scenario, the prospect is ideal or whatever. When you make a presentation to a real person who's different than the ideal prospects, what do you do then? So again, you have a series of if-then statements. If they think this way, I'll do this. If not, and you may not catch a lot of what'll actually happen. And that's the great thing about the idea of gaining distinctions and frameworks building is you'll go in with as much planning as you can reasonably do. And then you might gain new distinctions based on them bringing up objections or them responding in a way you didn't foresee at all. And you didn't really have much of a plan for. But then in the future, you'll have that. And then that still might not be enough for the next presentation. And they might bring up new things and have new responses. And then that's when you keep accumulating more stuff. But in the same niche for the same general product, you'll start to get to where, practically speaking, you'll have most of the, just not objections, but different categories, different objections, different stuff. You'll have it all worked in pretty well, where you get to the point where things aren't very new. If I'm talking to someone that believes in evolution, I could pretty much have both sides of the conversation myself, right? I don't do it that much these days, but for years, I got started with all this, working on a book just on my own initiative. No, I didn't have a publisher lined up or anything, but I was working on a book about creation and evolution, disproving evolution and so forth. And I was interested in that for years as a kind of specific topic. And then it was getting under that, even deeper than that was the next step. And that's where LOI and so forth came from. Anyway, the point there is you can get all the most of the realistic responses you're going to get. You start to accumulate. So that's how it works. Megan says, sorry to miss this live. Walking the Camino Santiago from Portugal to Spain and re-listening to David's mastery of frames and capstone MP3 is beautiful. Terrific, Megan. And I look forward to seeing you here live, presumably next week. Dave said, it seems like this ability to keep things clear would make strategy much easier, whereas mixing in a way that ends up in more blurriness makes things harder. That's correct. Does being able to carry through with this clearness have to do with getting to a deeper rooted understanding? Yeah, I would say so. He said, does it have to, sorry, I mumbled at the end there. He says, does being able to carry through with this clearness have to do with getting to a deeper rooted understanding of how things work? Yeah, I think that whereas that's not the only block, it's a major block. People being unable to distinguish between just building mental scenarios fully in their own mind as mental objects and not being concerned about the outside world as if it is relevant. Of course, things you learn from your experience with the outside world, so to speak, give you information and objects and distinctions that you're using in your mental scenarios, obviously. And of course, as I just talked about with the sales process, you can gain new distinctions as you go and interact again with the outside world. However, being able to stipulate and remain stipulating purely is, as I think about it, it's surprisingly difficult for people. And I'm glad I realized to explain that block. I witnessed it when I wasn't called up to be a prospective juror when they started interviewing you. I was kind of like in the audience where I was like a prospective juror. Oh, that were with jury duty, where they picked from those people. But they were interviewing prospective jurors to get to the final actual jurors. And the lawyer was asking people to stipulate. And it was shockingly hard for people to do. Like what specifically, there was a woman that was going to be on trial for what was illegal in Tennessee, or what is illegal apparently, is promoting prostitution. So she wasn't on trial for being a prostitute. She was on trial for promoting prostitution, which is like making like a business that overall creates and runs prostitution. So that was the charge. And the lawyer said to various people, one woman I could particularly picture her response, but it was pretty common. He said, all right, suppose that as the prosecution is making their case, they convince you that the evidence shows that my client, the defendant, is or did prostitution, but she didn't promote prostitution. She wasn't running a business of prostitution. She was just a prostitute or doing prostitution. What will you rule? What would you do? And of course, the legally correct answer and the logically correct answer, if you can think straight, is they'd be not guilty, because obviously that's not what they're charged with. They're not charged with being a prostitute, even if someone thinks, I'm certainly not saying that it's wrong or not. Personally, David Mills, I'm not commenting on morality. But if a person, I'm stipulating once again, if a person thought that prostitution was wrong, and even if they thought it should be punished, then legally they should still say the person's not guilty according to the law. But people couldn't even process that stipulation, that question. They would say things like, I'd have to see the evidence first. Of course, you don't have to see the evidence first, but that's disturbing that people can't even conceive of stipulating. And that was pretty freaking simple, given that it was pretty tangible, right? The idea, again, what was the question that the defense lawyer was asking the prospective jurors was, if you find her guilty of prostitution, what will you rule, given that she's not indicted for that, not being prosecuted? She's being prosecuted for promoting prostitution. And that simple, illogical question they couldn't answer. And that opened my eyes to how difficult basic thought is for some people. I don't think everyone's that way, where they can't do simple stipulations. Some people could answer the question, but it was weirdly rare that people just simply and straightforwardly answered such a simple, logical question, which is interesting. Suleiman, wrap things up in a minute. Suleiman says, nice insights, David, thanks. What would be helpful if we can do some role play? Yeah, you're right. You can be the first to volunteer. That would be great. If I had a little bit more energy, I would have you now. If you're around next time, or the next time you're around, you're up on. I appreciate that. I'd be happy to do that. I'm actually was thinking of doing that even this week. So I'd love to do a little role play, and I'd love to have you on. You can ask or do some role play, whatever, and we'll talk. So if you're on next time, let's assume that we'll do that. Jonathan says, wow, how did you figure this stuff out? I agree. That's the question. Wow, how did you figure all this stuff out? How did you break that barrier to go even deeper when I feel like none of these concepts would ever have emerged from anyone else. Practically speaking, that seems to be true. I don't quite know why. I don't quite know the answer to that. It's one of the eternal questions. And I appreciate you saying that and recognizing it. But yeah, I don't basically, but that's cool. It's always fun when so and so. Okay, I'll wrap up here, and I will look to do that with you, Suleiman. And next time, maybe it can become a bit of a thing. I think I'll look to open this up to people overall. So if you guys have some friends or whatever that they might want to come on, not that they couldn't have already given, you could have already given the link. Of course, I wouldn't object, but it'll be particularly open, and I'll probably post a link in OMGY, and I'll do this kind of discussion office hours thing. You're very welcome, Lawrence. Absolutely. Thanks again for awesome participation. I might have skipped over some stuff. Avocado. No, okay, good. I didn't skip over anything major here. Julie, do you happen to think that this will help you a bit through the week? Of course, it's a bit of a loaded question, and I know it's a little bit of an overall frame, but hopefully I provided something that might potentially help you additionally break through with what you're saying. Julie says, you constantly amaze me. I am confident that I wouldn't have any of these thoughts in my life if I lived to 110. Great. I don't, of course, need to feel like I'm better than other people, but I like people, of course, the usefulness and people feeling like it's unique and amazing is that there's a certain type of seriousness and a certain type of way to break through to other people. The more people say, wow, this is particularly unique and amazing, then the more people on the outside can take it seriously or have an incentive to take a look at it. So, and if people feel like, by contrast, if people say, oh, I've heard this before a zillion times, it sounds just like this, that, the other thing, then I feel like I haven't really gotten through to people because I don't think that's the case. I'll be happy if it was the case, but since it's practically speaking, it's not, then it would be an impediment to people getting it. So it's encouraging. Definitely will help. Thank you. That's wonderful, Julie. I'm glad you think that. Thanks, David. Always fantastic. Janine, I appreciate that, Janine. Of course, the major thing I'm trying to do at this point is get this over to people. That's where the nice statements and stuff, in addition to I appreciate the appreciation as a human being. It's always nice for that too. Brian says that the method of using if-then statements breaks down so many barriers of thought, like using JavaScript. The program doesn't care about the path, but it does require knowing what direction it's going and what comes next. Great takeaway from me tonight, David. Thanks. You're very welcome, Brian. And of course, I do think that you guys could think through if-then statements prior to this webinar and without my help. But there's certain kind of deep blocks or frames that can get in the way. And that the mental object thing, what I was talking about today, not that I necessarily communicated perfectly and not that I'm necessarily done, but what I began to talk about today and the overall topic, trying to talk about and even understand better for myself. By the way, I'm a little bit on the edge of discovering nuances and additional details and stuff with this topic itself for myself. Just so you know, I don't use it very much, but there's to some degree it's intuitive or something. So I'm working on it myself. But of course, people could do a lot of logic without my help. But then again, there's certain kind of deep frames and stuff that interfere as well. Jennifer says, thank you. You're very welcome. Very welcome, Julie. I feel that way every week. Wonderful. Need to re-listen ASAP, I guess is what you're referring to there. Great. Okay, guys. Awesome. Another great night and I appreciate you guys very much for coming online and participating. And I will see you guys next week.